All right. I believe we're good to go.
Right.
So,
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I am so pleased to welcome today our guest speaker, Martha Hartley. And let me just undo that really quickly so you can see everyone. And Martha is Director of Moravian Research and Co-Chair of the Hidden Town Project at Old Salem Museums and Gardens. A native of Winston-Salem, she received undergraduate degrees from Hollins College and spent a year in Paris during college. From the University of Virginia, she received her master's degree, Go Who's, in urban planning and a certificate in historic preservation. She is a preservation planner with varied experience, including community preservation, advocacy, and public awareness. For over 35 years, Martha and her husband, Michael, anthropologist and emeritus director of archaeology at Old Salem, have worked together with the archaeology, history, landscape, and preservation of Moravian communities in the Winston-Salem area. For their work, they have been honored to receive the David Schatzsnyder, I hope I got that right, Stipe Professional Award from Preservation North Carolina, the Archie K. Davis Award from the Wachovia Historical Society, and the Hall of Fame Community Service Award from the Liberian Organization of the Piedmont, the Minette C. Duffy Landscape Preservation Award from Preservation North Carolina to the Bethania Historical Association was on behalf of the Hartley's work. In the past decade, Martha's work at Old Salem has included horticulture outreach and the revised and expanded Old Salem National Historic Landmark District. Since December 2016, she has been involved in the Hidden Town Project to research and reveal the history of Africans and African descended people in Salem. Let's welcome Martha Hartley. Hi, Martha.
Hello. Well, thank you so much, Renate. And thank you for having me with you all today. Should I go ahead and start my screen share here?
Yes, please do.
Let's see here.
And it's all your time.
Okay, good. Well, everyone, I was honored to hear Renate speak at Wake Forest University about 3 weeks ago. And then she gave me the honor of coming to Old Salem where I could share with her. And so it's really great to be with you all today to share with you some of the work that we're doing at the museum. I'd like to say that there are friends here in the audience for whom this history is personal, and I really thank you for attending. So thank you so much. All right. Let me get myself ready here. All right. As Renate said, 6 years ago, Old Salem launched the Hidden Town Project to expand on decades of work at the museum to research and reveal the history of Africans and African-derived people in the town of Salem. The history is hard history, but it is a legacy, and crucially, it informs the present day. History is about people, and genealogy plays a vital role in our work to identify individuals, understand their relationships, and where they were on the landscape over time. Located in Piedmont, North Carolina, Winston-Salem is a vibrant city of 250,000 people in Forsyth County. The city was built by European-born and descended people and African-born and descended people. They are the city's DNA. Old Salem's antique buildings are prominent in the foreground here. Called the City of Arts and Innovation, Winston-Salem gets its credentials from the Moravian Church, which began building the community in the 1750s. Their archival records tell us much about the past. The Moravian Church tradition of record keeping is unparalleled and provides treasure for research in the church board minutes and records, formal diaries, journals, maps, paintings, photographs, and more. Located in Old Salem, the Moravian Archives in Winston-Salem has been the repository since the 18th century. Moravian Archives in Pennsylvania and Germany also hold resources related to North Carolina Moravians. Today, the Salem in Winston-Salem is Old Salem, a National Historic Landmark tourist destination and 90-acre neighborhood with residences, Moravian Church entities, Salem Academy and College, and the oldest standing African-American church in North Carolina. St. Philip's Moravian Church is a remarkable touchstone for the Black experience in Winston-Salem. They are spiritual descendants of one of the oldest African-American congregations of any denomination in the United States and celebrated their 201st anniversary on May 5th, and I attended their service this morning here in Old Salem. Significant in American history, the congregation has been engaged by the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, and the local community is interested in the deep history as well. St. Philip's is the only historic Black Moravian church in the United States. This is in stark contrast to the worldwide Moravian Church, which is majority people of color, particularly in Africa and the Caribbean, legacy of missionary work. Global church leaders convened in Winston-Salem several years ago and visited St. Philip's. St. Philip's uniqueness is the story of the Moravian Church in the American South and speaks to the complicated history of slavery and its enduring effect, which brought about the hidden town. The Moravian Church made a formal apology for slavery in 2006. Conciliation is the hard part. The modern Moravian Church was born through the patronage and leadership of Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf and his Philadelphian ideas in the 1720s in Saxony and his revival of the Unitas Fratrum. The ancient Protestant group has its origins in 15th century Bohemia and the philosophy of John Huss, whose followers established the Unitas Fratrum in 1457. At the same time, Portuguese ships seeking gold in Africa began filling their holds with human cargo. New World labor needs then fueled the transatlantic slave trade. In America, land was stolen from native peoples and exploited for wealth creation through the labor of kidnapped, enslaved Africans, crimes against humanity of epic proportion and with durable impact. In the 1730s, the renewed Moravian Church in Herrnhut embarked on global mission work, beginning with enslaved people in the West Indies and soon extending to Greenland, South America, and Africa. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania was the first permanent Moravian congregation in North America, and in 1753 they purchased 100,000 acres in backcountry North Carolina and named it Wachovia. Although the Moravians had encountered Native Americans in their land search across North Carolina, indigenous people had already been pushed from the Wachovia land. We must acknowledge the sin of colonialization, subjugation, and land theft. Wachovia was 250 miles from the sea, but positioned to trade via overland routes. Moravians were excellent planners and created an unparalleled place in 18th century America. The beginning was made at Bethabara, followed by Bethania, then the central town of Salem. Ambitious Moravian plans were constrained by their small population, and renting labor, white and Black, brought them into direct relationship with enslaved people. Central European architecture was transplanted to early Wachovia. The half-timber single brothers house in Salem was completed in 1769, which also marks when the Wachovia Moravians began their role as enslaver. A teenager called Sam was rented in Bethabara. He was a skilled cattle handler who showed an inclination for conversion and was offered for sale by his owner. The lot approved the purchase of Sam in 1769. Baptized 2 years later as Johannes Samuel, he became a Moravian single brother, a spiritual equal who was owned by his brothers, a paradox. He returned to Bethabara, where he later married and had a family. 6 Moravian congregations were established in Wachovia during the colonial period: Bethabara, Bethania, Salem, Friedberg, Freeland, and Hope, from which there are 30 Moravian churches in Forsyth County today. Wachovia land was also available to non-Moravians. Wachovia and Winston-Salem are directly related. The map on the right shows Forsyth County with the Wachovia Tract at its core. Winston-Salem in pink nearly fills the Moravian Tract. Free and enslaved Africans and African-derived people contributed to the building and function of Wachovia. And in Salem, they were recorded as cutting wood, digging clay, breaking stone, making bricks and roofing tiles, and assisting in construction. Salem was a theocratic town where slave ownership was limited to the church, with the hope of keeping enslaved numbers low and the Moravian work ethic high. Like most religious groups in America, the Moravians did not object to slavery, but regarded one's place in life as ordained by God, with salvation the key. In time, a small number of enslaved people chose conversion and were considered spiritual equals. This integrated fellowship for Afro-Moravians included worship and burial practices, as well as educational opportunities. An African called Sambo was purchased for the Salem tannery. He resisted twice, was punished, and nearly sold, but after several years sought conversion. Baptized as Abraham, he married the enslaved Sarah, and he became a communicant Moravian. Because he was a Moravian, we know much about Abraham. He was recorded in available primary source documentation, especially church records, including his purchase in 1771. This slide shows a selection of information that we have put together in our Hidden Town biography file for Abraham. The Carter Center information is relevant as President and Mrs. Carter have led the eradication of the guinea worm in Africa. Sambo arrived in Wachovia with a guinea worm in his toe, which ultimately had to be amputated. Abraham's story has been included in multiple scholarly works about slavery in Salem and Wachovia, and these are some examples. A particularly informative research document is the Lebenslauf, or memoir. In the Moravian tradition, this sort of autobiography and spiritual reflection is prepared by a church member during their lifetime, and then is completed by the minister at the person's death and read at their funeral. Abraham's memoir is revealing, quote, "Our dear brother Abraham, otherwise called Sambo, a Negro from the Mandinka nation on the coast of African Guinea, was born about the year 1730. It appears that his father was a respected man among his countrymen. Through diligent praying, he established a religious way of thinking himself, though this was mixed with heathen superstition. When he grew up and was already father of several children, he went to war like others in the frequent hostilities with the neighboring tribes. In one of those wars, he was wounded severely in the head and face and was taken prisoner, and then sent back to his father with mutilated ears. He, the father, became so angry about this that he stirred the inhabitants of the community to one another, to another war to get his revenge. They started at once, and Sambo, wounded though he was, did not let them keep him from following them. Now he was taken prisoner for the second time and sold to European slave traders, who brought him to the West Indies and sold him on a French island. He was there for several years. Later, he was brought to Virginia. In August 1770, his master, H. Lyon, intended to sell him again and brought him with two other Negroes to Brother Herbst, the tanner here. And it goes on, end quote, for this excerpt. Recognizing that the voice and bias is white European, it is nevertheless remarkable information about an enslaved person in 18th century America. Abraham was a respected tradesman. He remained enslaved, but in death, the spiritual equality buried him in the Moravian God's Acre in Salem. Graveyards hold stories, well-known, little-known, and unknown. Here are examples from Old Hope Moravian Church, God's Acre. Salem was a town of artisans. A university-trained doctor was in residence, and music was central to this religious community that sought separation from others. But commerce meant dealings with non-Moravians. The Salem Tavern was the interface and operated with the use of enslaved workers as maids, field hands, hostlers, waiters, for kitchen work and housework from its opening in 1772 until emancipation. For that 93-year period, we have identified 50 people, including Peter and Louisa, who were working there when President George Washington spent 2 nights in 1791. We have hosted 2 slave dwelling projects with high school students there, sleeping where enslaved people slept, at the tavern and the Single Brothers House, using the historic place as a teaching tool. Fallout from the American Revolution nurtured fresh ideas about individual freedom and choice. Labor shortages prompted renting labor, and increasing numbers of Black people, free and enslaved, normalized that presence. Salem households began to rent enslaved women and girls for childcare and domestic needs. Enslaved people in Wachovia were often moved from one community to another. Salem looked like this in the painting when Peter Oliver was moved there from Bethania. Even as a rented teenager, he directed his life toward freedom. He pressed the Moravians to buy him, requested baptism, became a Moravian single brother, and lived in the brother's house. Peter Oliver is remembered for his role in the Moravian pottery. Although there is no attributable work by him, it is no doubt his skillful hands contributed to the operation. Free in 1800, he soon married Christina Bass, a free woman of color working in Salem. Peter Oliver leased a 4-acre parcel a few blocks north of Salem Square in a creek valley with a spring. We located the farm site 6 years ago. He had a house built, and the Olivers began their family. Mel White was Old Salem's director of African American programs, who discovered and connected branches for the Oliver family 24 years ago. Our genealogy base is the work of Mr. White, the accomplished genealogist on whose shoulders we stand. Since then, the Oliver family has celebrated with reunions and gatherings. We commemorated the 200th anniversary of Peter Oliver's death in 2010. He was buried in God's Acre, not far from Abraham. There are many descendants, and you may recognize a famous local one, Chris Paul, the NBA All-Star. Invisible under 200 years development, the Oliver farm site is in design by the important landscape architect Walter Hood for a memorial park. Peter Oliver was one of 2 or 3 enslaved Moravians who lived in the single brother's house. Anna Maria Samuel is the only known Afro-Moravian to have lived in the single sister's house. She was the oldest child of Johann Samuel and his wife Maria in Bethabara, and she moved to Salem to enter the older girls' choir and attend school, now known as Salem Academy and College, the oldest institution of higher learning for women and girls in America. Her experience was unique, however, and the idea of spiritual equality would not last. At an Easter service in 1789, Blacks were not permitted to sit in church as usual. Tension was evident within the Moravian acculturation process. A few years later, church board minutes reported, quote, "It was mentioned that we must not be ashamed of those Negroes who belong to our community, and as happened before, let them sit all by themselves in the congregational worshipings, and even during Holy Communion. They are our brothers and sisters, and different treatment of them will degrade ourselves to the rank of ordinary people of this world, and will be a disgrace for the community," end quote. The Moravian acculturation is addressed in a new publication by Brill Academic Press, just out this year, which includes my chapter on slavery. Population in the Moravian Tract continued to grow. In 1800, Wachovia was part of Stokes County, where 1,439 slaves were counted, 63 of whom were in Wachovia. Regular segregated services had begun in the outlying congregations of Hope, Friedberg, and Bethania. The Salem town lot is highlighted on these maps in yellow. At Salem's western side, Gottlieb Schober established a paper mill along Peters Creek, which powered the mill. The human power came from enslaved people. Since the operation was outside of town, slave regulations did not apply. Born in Africa, Timothy and Fanny were enslaved at the paper mill in the early 1800s, but research indicates that they were enslaved in the Wachovia area by the 1770s. We discovered this in Mr. White's genealogical information that indicated children's place of birth near Hope Moravian Church. We are still searching for proof of sequence of Timothy and Fanny enslavers. Timothy was over 100 years old at death, but never learned to speak English well, interpreted as a sign of resistance. He and Fanny were buried in the Negro God's Acre in Salem. They have many descendants. Historian Spencer McCall, who's at this meeting, is working on a book about the family, and his cousin Lucretia Berry devotes herself to racism awareness. I recommend her TED Talk. We hosted Timothy and Fanny descendants last August during an 82nd annual family reunion. In the log church in Old Salem, stories are told through art. Here are Spencer and Lucretia with interpretations of their great-great-great-great-great-great grandparents. Since 2018, Old Salem has been an organizational member of the Piedmont Triad chapter of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. Chapter co-founder Lamar Deloach is a knowledgeable and gifted leader who inspires and educates. OGS members are excellent genealogists, and I learn at each meeting. Back to our history. In 1800, Salem's new church architecture signaled changing styles and attitudes. By this time, Blacks were being held at the church door or turned away as segregation of worship gained traction. Also at this time, the mission-oriented Moravians began mission work from Salem to the Cherokee in Spring Place, Georgia. Begun in 1801, it continued through the devastating removal to Oklahoma and into the late 19th century. A new dynamic in Salem was the girls' boarding school. Moravian schools were renowned the world over, and the school in Salem for Moravian girls had begun in 1772. Non-Moravian families pressed for a boarding school, as education for girls was rare in the South. In 1804, the first students arrived. By 1810, enslaved labor was purchased and rented to support school needs. Born in Africa, Phoebe and Bodney were an enslaved communicant Moravian couple when purchased with several of their children by the church in 1810. They were placed at the Wachovia Administration Farm for church-owned slaves, and here you can see they were inventoried with the livestock in 1817. The farm was one of several growing up around Salem where the slave rules in town did not apply. Bodney was the farm manager there. Their daughter Betsy was purchased for the girls' school. Sam was a rented enslaved man at the Single Sisters house, and fears of their association prompted removal to a nearby farm where they were married and began a family. Slavery in Salem was generational. Although the Atlantic slave trade had ended by act of Congress in 1807, there were already over 1 million slaves in the United States, and the domestic trade became robust. 6 years ago, students at Salem College protested, demanding them to know the role of slavery at their school. Since that time, the school has embarked on a discovery process and joined the University Studying Slavery Consortium, with over 80 colleges and universities investigating their slave past. Phoebe's infant died in 1813 and was the last person of African descent to be buried in God's Acre. And in 1816, a segregated Negro God's Acre was established at the former parish graveyard. The mapping exercise for early 19th century Salem indicates concentrations of enslaved people growing up outside of Salem, circled in red. Although rules about slaves remained in force in town, some residents continually pushed against them. Dots on the map indicate enslaved who were rented or owned. Leadership, frustrated by the growing numbers, re-emphasized the slave regulations in 1820 to prohibit the use of slaves in trades, but to allow households to rent slaves if approved. To understand the slavery dynamic in Salem, the Hidden Town Research Program was initiated in January 2018. I'm located in the Wachovia room, where we have a collection of research materials. Over the past 5.5 years, I've hosted 29 interns from colleges and universities as Hidden Town researchers. Most of the students are white and have various exposure to the history of slavery. This crowdsourced document is a basic educational tool that I share with them. Old Salem Museum was established in 1950 to restore the town of Salem, and this aspirational model was built as a fundraising tool in 1951. But for those of you who haven't visited Old Salem, it gives an idea of the museum village. Research has always been the foundation of Old Salem's presentation and interpretation, and the museum has significant developed research archives in addition to the buildings, landscape, and decorative arts of this historic place. The systematic study of individual lots in Salem reveals information on the micro and macro levels. As an example, I'll share about the Winkler Bakery on Lot 31, circled here. Winkler Bakery is the most popular stop in Old Salem with its sugar cake and cookies. The checklist at the right is the research roadmap for the students to engage in the signed documentation, which produces a research folder about the lot. They learn skills of research and analysis, and most are exposed to primary source documentation for the first time. They, in turn, create substantial research files about their assigned lot's evolution and the associated enslaved people. Here are examples of checklist items in the Lot 31 folder, which includes an analysis prepared by the student at the end of the semester. In the course of research on Lot 31, 7 people of African descent were encountered, and the student then worked to build their biography files. Some identification remains only cryptic, but others can be developed using Mr. White's genealogy database and other information. The file drawers in the picture at the right show our drawers of biography files that have various levels of detail, but to date, we've identified over 200 people. Organization is by first name, as enslaved people were considered property and did not have surnames. Here is the locational map for Lot 31 in Old Salem. You see that all the lots are numbered, a system that dates to Salem's origin. This is my composite map of lot research so far. Of the 30 or so lots we have researched, enslaved people have been present on every lot at some point during a 100-year period from 1766 to emancipation. In Salem, the sacred segregated completely in 1822 when a Christian congregation was organized as a mission to the enslaved people in and around Salem. The Salem Female Missionary Society led the initiative and funded the construction of a log church built adjacent to the new Negro God's Acre. The white women supported the congregation, especially as teachers into the 20th century. The Negro congregation was later named St. Philip's. In this painting, the white Moravian church is at the far left and the Negro church is at the far right. Sunday was typically the only day off for enslaved people, and they could choose church or not. In an urban place like Salem, where enslaved families did not usually live together, church time united them and their friends, but the Moravians vied with the more charismatic Methodist and Baptist services in the area. Entrepreneurship drove industrialization in early 19th century Salem. The grist mill in the foreground was built in 1820 with private money and without the church. A banking agency established in 1815 would evolve into the Wachovia Bank after the Civil War. An 1831 state law requiring militias no longer exempted the formerly pacifist Moravians. Salem's young men enthusiastically formed their unit. Fears of slave rebellions had prompted such readiness in North Carolina. At times, slave patrols were organized in Salem. In addition, new state law prohibited teaching slaves to read and write, but arithmetic continued in the church school. This painting views Salem from the outlying farm of town doctor Henry Schumann. In the foreground is his landscape and his house. He lived across Salem Creek and ran a successful farm using enslaved labor. In 1836, he decided to move into town where slave regulations prohibited bringing his enslaved people. He manumitted the 17 people he owned and sent them with 6 others to Liberia in Africa. After emancipation, this landscape of Dr. Schumann's farm was developed as Happy Hill, the first African-American neighborhood in Winston-Salem. At our 2019 landscape conference in Old Salem, Professor Kofi Boone keynoted with his lecture, Black Landscapes Matter. Landscape mattered when the Liberia-Salem connection was revealed in Happy Hill through the city's historic marker program made possible through Old Salem's research. There is a large Liberian population in the area, many of whom fled Liberia's bloody civil wars beginning in 1989. For more than a decade, Old Salem has partnered with the Liberian organization, the Piedmont, to elevate the historic connection. Liberian dignitaries regularly visit Winston-Salem. The mayor of Monrovia, Liberia's capital, is shown at the right listening to Phyllis's story in the log church. Phyllis and her family were enslaved by Dr. Schumann. She died before the manumission, but her mother, son, and all of her siblings immigrated to Liberia, and there are likely descendants there today. Major industry was established in Salem in the 1830s with one of the first cotton mills in the state, soon followed by the Freeze Woolen Mill, where much enslaved labor was used, as it had begun decades earlier at Schober's paper mill, but this time in town. The rules about slaveholding were increasingly challenged. Slavery in Salem was urban slavery. But out in Wachovia, there were large farms and plantations which depended on enslaved labor. And beyond Salem, there were not regulations that determined slave ownership. History is always personal, and so I'll share this with you. My grandmother's family has deep Bethania roots with lines back to an early Moravian couple from Europe who became the first householders there. Their son, William Grobbs, was a Bethania enslaver enumerated in 1790. Bethania always had the largest enslaved population in Wachovia. This transcription of the 1860 slave schedule for Bethania enumerated 240 individuals. A child named Betty may be this enumeration. Betty Coger was born on the Conrad Jones plantation in Bethania. She was recorded in a WPA interview in the 1930s. Extant slave cabins on the farm are in ruin today. As in Salem, a congregation for the enslaved had been formed in Bethania, there in the 1840s. But after emancipation, the church became Bethania AME Zion Church. Descendants of Bethania's enslaved population continue to live around the Main Street core. A historic marker acknowledges their heritage, but much work remains to be done there. My husband's dissertation, Choices on the Land, discusses our preservation efforts in the late 1980s and early 1990s in Bethania. Descendant Ali Shabazz has been leading preservation efforts in Bethania for decades. His ancestors had been enslaved on the Conrad Jones plantation. Mr. Shabazz is a powerful force, and through his own efforts has preserved his grandparents' home and established a place of memory and honor. Through his activism, Bethania's African-American history is gaining recognition. Bethania descendant Priscilla Glenn Cairns published her excellent history in 2014, and it connects Bethania's African-American families. With this momentum, efforts are currently underway to recognize a part of Bethania's history with the National Register Historic District. Mr. Shabazz, Marty Edwards, and I are facilitating the project. Hidden Town resources are available to researchers and scholars, and I met Marty Shore Edwards when she came to do research in the Wachovia room. Marty is a Bethania descendant who lives in Winston-Salem. In 2021, she visited with another Bethania descendant, William Lash, who lives in Washington, D.C. They had connected through online genealogy and learned they are related through slavery. Her family enslaved his family. In our research, we find that understanding white relationships can be the key to identifying people of African descent and understanding their relationships. Faye Moran's White Moravian Genealogy is invaluable to our work, and she has an excellent website. A recent experience underscored this for me when I was contacted by a local genealogist working on a church newsletter story about a founder of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Winston-Salem. The historic person who was a co-founder or was a founder of the church was named Laura Limley, and she had lived in Salem in the mid to late 1800s. In 1851, Miss Limley had moved from Bethania to Salem with her parents and grandmother. The question to me was, where did they live, including the enslaved people owned by Laura's family? Well, they lived in what we call the Jacob Seaver's house in Old Salem. It's on lot 21. The Limleys were a very well-to-do family with wealth from two of the largest slave owners in Bethania, Jacob Conrad and John Christian Lash. We had researched the Salem lot and could share much information that was new to her about the enslaved people our research had identified. Kathy Boyer, the genealogist, shared documents which helped fill some gaps for us as well. I was able to share the significance of the family enslaved by the Conrad Limleys with her. We know much about them. The father was Emmanuel, a son of Phoebe and Bodney, the founders of the Negro congregation, and Emmanuel's son, Ned Limley, was the first property owner in Happy Hill. This information gave Kathy a new sense of the history of the white family. Mid-century brought sweeping changes. Salem's slave regulations were abolished as unenforceable. Not every Moravian was a slaveholder, but numbers increased. There remained those who opposed slavery as well. With population growth, Forsyth County was created out of Stokes County in 1849. Salem was the obvious choice for the courthouse, but with church objections to court proceedings, executions, and other such business, Salem sold 51 acres for the new county seat, soon named Winston. Architecture informs change once again. In this photograph of the stylish New Salem Academy building, columns and hoop skirts recall the Old South. The figures may not all be Moravian, but the scene reflects a Southern town. Salem leadership ended the theocracy in 1856, and the landscape was immediately altered when Salem Cemetery was created adjacent to God's Acre. 2 years later, a contiguous segregated burial ground was established. Phoebe died in 1861 and was buried in the new graveyard. The WA on her marker indicated that she was owned by the Wachovia administration. Efforts are underway by the Salem congregation to uplift this graveyard through grave identification, marking, and proper attention. In 1860, 14% of Forsyth County's population was enslaved. Salem residents enslaved approximately 135 men, women, and children, including 47 at the Freeze Mill. The 1860 slave schedule also enumerated about 35 slave houses in Salem. Research indicates these were likely outbuildings with other primary uses, such as a kitchen, a laundry, or a shop. None survive above ground. Some enslaved people lived in the enslaver's home. An exception to all this is the house built specifically for Christian David in 1835. It is the only domestic site of an enslaved person explored archaeologically in Old Salem. Christian David's story is told at the log church, where he was a church leader. Through virtual reality, Middle Tennessee State University is helping to envision the invisible landscape of slavery. We hope to examine domestic sites of enslaved people through archaeology. Our research has determined that the Bloom House on Main Street was a location of enslaved people. A long-gone rear detached kitchen is speculated as a slave house. NC State University has assisted with geophysics as a first step toward archaeology. In the foreground of this 1860s photograph is a laundry that we think was used to house an enslaved girl, as enumerated in the federal census. Dana Johnson's master's thesis was a study of the building and a virtual reality of the interior as a slave dwelling. She used photogrammetry of artifacts in the collection to populate the scene. The federal census is an important research tool, and the 1860 slave schedule tells us much. Although enslaved people are not named in the census, through research, we think the 37-year-old male is David Schober, who probably lived in the brick kitchen shown. David and his wife, Betsy Ann, were associated with the Negro congregation, but owned by different people. She was enslaved on the nearby Wall plantation with their children. Their son, James Francis Schober, went on to greatness. He graduated from Lincoln University, followed by medical school at Howard University, and he became a highly respected physician in Wilmington, North Carolina. He died at the young age of 35, leaving a wife and 2 daughters. It is said that he worked himself to death as the only Black physician in a city with over 10,000 African Americans. But that was only a dream for young James Francis in 1861, at the beginning of the Civil War, when the large brick church was built for the enslaved congregation known as the African Church in Salem. At the end of the war, Union troops occupied Salem, and on May 21, 1865, freedom was announced in the church by the chaplain of the 10th Ohio Regiment. It's our local Juneteenth. In the sanctuary that day was, no doubt, church leader Lewis Heggie, who had been enslaved next door by George Heggie. During archaeological excavation there in 2005, research in the federal census slave schedule illuminated the value of slave house enumeration and what that meant for the historic Salem landscape. Lewis Heggie helped lead efforts to build a freedmen's school in Salem. The freedmen prioritized education for their children and built the school in 1867 on land provided lease-free by the Moravian Church. A historic marker in Happy Hill honors this significant history, as this is now at a place that's part of Happy Hill. The Schumann Farm continued to figure prominently in the landscape of freedom. Some Salem residents had objected to freedmen buying property in town, and the church settled on a segregated solution across the creek. Around the former Schumann house in 1872, they began development of a little town they called Liberia, and lots were available to freedmen for $10 each. Soon known as Happy Hill, it was the first African-American neighborhood in Winston-Salem. Ned Limley and Richard Sievers became the first property owners in Happy Hill. Both men had been enslaved in Salem, and you'll recall that Ned Limley had also been enslaved by the Conrad family in Bethania. Mr. Limley and Mr. Sievers made homes for their wives and children as the first of many African-American families to live in Happy Hill. The Happy Hill Cemetery dates from the 1880s and likely earlier. Death certificates recorded more than 1,500 burials as recorded earlier. However, hundreds of graves were moved for U.S. Highway 52. Over time, the sacred ground was lost in tangles and vandalism, and Maurice Pitts Johnson sought assistance from Old Salem Archaeology. Retrieval was launched in 2010, and Mrs. Johnson continues monthly work with volunteers. Her grandparents were early Happy Hill residents who are buried there. In the expansion of the Old Salem National Historic Landmark District, we were able to make the case for including a portion of Happy Hill, that which had been tested archaeologically. The South collapsed with defeat in the Civil War, but Salem's economy rebounded relatively quickly. Attracted to existing infrastructure and the new rail line, R.J. Reynolds came in 1874 to establish his tobacco empire. His offer of manufacturing work then brought many rural Black people into Winston-Salem, boosting the Black population to nearly 40% by the turn of the century. The African Church was expanded in 1890 to meet educational demands of children and adults. The Atwood Sewing Circle and other church programs kept the Black Moravians engaged. The small congregation consistently supported Moravian missionaries abroad. African Americans lived throughout Salem in duplexes, tenements, and single-family homes. Sanborn fire insurance maps offer clues to long-gone housing. The tenements, labeled Chris Bottom in the photograph, are the tenements highlighted on the map near Church Street. Note the diagonal street by the tenements, which is now a path through Salem College dorms in the vicinity of the long-gone African-American housing. The 1898 Democratic Party victory in North Carolina solidified white supremacy, and African Americans endured growing racism and overall injustices. Winston and Salem grew side by side until the 1913 consolidation. It was also the year that the gravestones disappeared from the Negro God's Acre. In 1914, the African Church was named St. Philip's Moravian Church. Textiles and tobacco made Winston-Salem the largest and wealthiest city in North Carolina until the Great Depression. African Americans participated in the growing economy with an influx of new residents and professional opportunities. Winston-Salem State University was founded in 1892 by Simon Green Atkins. Black city residents included attorneys, physicians, dentists, ministers, factory workers, barbers, restaurant owners, grocers, funeral directors, chauffeurs, domestics, insurance agents, teachers, and others. Happy Hill grew as a cohesive neighborhood, and by 1920, about 130 families lived on the beautiful rolling landscape above the Salem Creek bottom. Salem Academy and College expanded in the 1920s to create the familiar campus of today. The laundry scene at the construction of Cluel Dormitory emphasizes the enormous labor needs of the school. This group of college laundry workers was supervised by Happy Hill resident Viola Page Harvey, a descendant of Timothy and Fanny. From her niece, Georgiana Page McCoy, is this photograph of school employees, including Mrs. McCoy's mother, Edith Limley Page, and her uncle, Clarence Page. Mrs. McCoy's father, Sherman Page, a descendant of Timothy and Fanny, was also a school employee. At right is a photograph of Mrs. McCoy as a girl with her mother and sister on the lawn of their Happy Hill home. Her mother was a descendant of Phoebe and Bodney. Like the Pages, many school employees lived in Happy Hill. Residents walked to their jobs at the school or to tobacco factories or to other employers. Access to Happy Hill required crossing Salem Creek, which was dangerous as the old bridge had washed away. The Metal Truss Bridge was built in 1936 through the perseverance of Happy Hill resident Wade Bidding Sr. and is a historic structure in use today. Mr. Bidding led many other important neighborhood initiatives. In the summer of 2021, the historic bridge was named in Mr. Bidding's honor. and a large crowd gathered for the ceremony. City directories inform African American presence on the Salem landscape. Small yellow dots indicate households. The larger blue dots indicate numbers of households. Black people had lived in Salem since the colonial period, but Jim Crow laws changed all that. Salem became a segregated white neighborhood by the first decades of the 20th century, and the Black presence became a hidden town. St. Philip's Moravian Church is marked with a gold star. The congregation was at that site for more than 100 years when Old Salem, the museum, was established in 1950 to restore the town. St. Philip's had wanted to move for decades, and they did so in 1952. They moved across the creek to Happy Hill under the leadership of their first Black pastor. At the time, the city's first public housing project, Happy Hill Gardens, was under construction. New people meant new possibility. Unfortunately, the best laid plans and a new church building were destroyed by US Highway 52, and the congregation moved again 4 miles north to Bonaire Avenue. Residential security maps, or redlining, were formal means of racial discrimination in the United States where neighborhoods were graded for quality and desirability. The 1937 map of Winston-Salem shows African American neighborhoods in red for D, the 4th grade, and the least desirable. The implications were severe as Black neighborhoods were highlighted as high risks and denied loans or fair loans, and homes were undervalued, all depriving African Americans of wealth building. Municipal infrastructure was withheld from Black neighborhoods and led to disrepair, which often ended with demolition. Public policy targeted Black neighborhoods for urban renewal and highway development. I've added the highway corridors to the redlining map, and you can see how Interstate 40 and US 52 blasted through stable African American neighborhoods in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The purple circle indicates Happy Hill, where Highway 52 took St. Philip's new church and where urban renewal demolished 14 city blocks for public housing. The new highway alignments were a connect-the-dot exercise across Black neighborhoods. Destruction included businesses, churches, livelihoods, and social fabric. The first section of I-40 in North Carolina to open was the part through downtown in 1958, which eradicated the Blue Street neighborhood in East Winston. Barbara Morris is a St. Philip's Moravian who grew up in that neighborhood with her grandmother. Active in the civil rights movement, she continues to advocate for the neighborhood memory. When 52 was built, the highways intersected at the original location of the Blue Street neighborhood. This aerial looks across the eradication of place to downtown Winston-Salem and the area now known as Innovation Quarter. In December 2020, a mural by a former colleague, the artist Leo Rucker, was dedicated in the Innovation Quarter. Barbara Morris is one of the people memorialized on the mural, and she is shown standing next to her nearly completed portrait. The mural records people and places in the once thriving African American downtown of East Winston, lost to highway development and urban renewal. US 52 remains a barrier and excludes East Winston from downtown's revitalization. Following George Floyd's murder 3 years ago, groundswell response prompted local demonstrations and called out this highway history. Young activists occupied 52, shutting it down. One activist said, quote, "Nobody should live in this city and not know the truth," end quote. Lest we think highways no longer hurt Black people, Sarah Hill Carter knows better. She's an active member of the West Salem neighborhood. She is also a storyteller and has performed at Old Salem. 6 years ago, she was traumatized to learn that her home of almost 40 years was to be demolished for a new Salem Parkway interchange. At that time, WFDD, our local public radio station, did a feature on Sarah and the highway impacts. When I asked Sarah her permission to tell this story, she was fine with that, but offered that she still suffers from what was done to her. From the 1950s through the 1980s, the old St. Philip's Church building sat empty in Old Salem until St. Philip's Anniversary Day in 1989, when a tornado damaged the church. It was the impetus for retrieval. Earnest efforts began to address this highly significant place and to understand the complicated history. Scholars worked through archival information, and architects and engineers addressed the damaged building. An early surprise were 20 gravestones discovered under the church hall floor. There were names unseen for decades: Timothy, a native of Africa, Rose, and others. Later, 11 more gravestones were found behind the front steps. Archaeology determined the grave markers had been removed from the graveyard in 1913 during a beautification project. Archaeology is invaluable to understanding and revealing the graveyards and without intrusion into burials. Although not trained as an archaeologist, I made good labor under the church in 1996. The graveyard's meaning and visibility are essential. Like the church, the land is sacred. In the Moravian tradition, St. Philip's sisters prepare the graveyard every Easter. Archival list recorded 131 burials in the graveyards. Since nearly all are unidentified, a memorial plaque on the front of the restored church records the name and death date of each interred person. The church restoration project reestablished the deep relationship between Happy Hill and St. Philip's, with the historic pathway revealed behind the church. St. Philip's was a $3 million capital campaign project for Old Salem and opened in 2003 as part of the Old Salem experience. We celebrate 2 decades now of this wonderful place. The church sanctuary is powerful sacred space, and the historic building is now the church home for St. Philip's. It has served many functions since the restoration. The Hidden Town project builds on and expands 3 decades of work at Old Salem. Our work is also about community engagement, and the Hidden Town project continues to advocate for revitalization of historic Happy Hill, called the mother of all Black neighborhoods in Winston-Salem. In 1998, when Mel White was director of African American programs, he led the gathering of oral histories and photographs from descendants and other African American families in Happy Hill for the 1998 landmark exhibit Across the Creek from Salem, The Story of Happy Hill. In storage for 25 years, last year we celebrated its revival with the installation of the new exhibit, Selections from Across the Creek, Happy Hill. The exhibit is free and open to the public in the Old Salem Visitor Center and is digitally available on our website. Part of the exhibit is an oral history interview by Jonathan Serrano. Jonathan was the inaugural Hidden Town Research Fellow who was a Happy Hill resident and brought a community voice into the project. He researched the Bidding family, and we co-presented at the 2021 Black History Month Genealogy Conference. Last summer, visiting education coordinator Taneya Garrison worked with Hidden Town on a foodways oral history project in Happy Hill. Her childhood home had been in Happy Hill Gardens. She conducted 9 interviews, some in Happy Hill and some here in the Wachovia room, that are archived at Old Salem. Taneya is a current PhD candidate in American history at UNC Chapel Hill. The Hidden Town Project supports efforts of the Happy Hill Neighborhood Association in their various activities. Cheryl Harry and her Triad Cultural Arts are leading the effort to create a Black Heritage Center in Happy Hill, using art and culture for neighborhood revival. This project is featured in the new exhibit at Old Salem. We are partnering with both groups for the Freedom Day celebration in 2 weeks, and all of you are invited. Hidden Town participates in Truth, Reconciliation, and Reparation in Forsyth County through the Institute for Dismantling Racism. We led a webinar in November of 2021 to discuss reparative planning through reparative justice through urban planning. And we're currently working to develop reparation action initiatives for the new comprehensive planning process for Winston-Salem and Forsyth County. Understanding truth in history is basic. We live in the legacy of slavery and perpetual unfairness, but the realities of the history are not broadly known across the white community. Black people have lived it. As a museum devoted to local history, we have a responsibility to continue to research and learn, to reveal the history, and to participate in the conversation. I thank you all for the opportunity to be with you today. And I've posted here the Hidden Town website has lots more information and many, many links to various other resources about this topic. So I encourage you to visit that, oldsalem.org/Hidden Town Project. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing.
Wow. Thank you so much, Martha. I'm going to wait for you to stop your share, and I'm going to cut the recording.